The wind had a name in this part of the territory, but it was not a name for polite company. It was a sculptor of bad tempers and cracked lips, a thief that stole the moisture from a body and left nothing but grit behind. It carried the red dust of the high plains in a constant, hazy shroud, blurring the edges of the distant mesas until they looked like sleeping giants dreaming under a white-hot sun. The stagecoach groaned, its wooden bones protesting every rut and rock in the trail that passed for a road. Inside, Lena Hart felt the dust in her lungs, a fine powder that made each breath a conscious effort. At 22 years old, she had believed herself prepared for the West. She had read pamphlets in Boston that spoke of boundless opportunity and skies of an impossible blue. They did not mention the dust or the way the heat pressed down like a physical weight. She pressed her back against the worn leather seat, the motion of the coach a constant, jarring rhythm against her spine. Her hand rested on the worn Bible in her lap, its cover softened by the hands of her mother and grandmother. Tucked inside was the letter, her supposed salvation, a vaguely worded introduction to the town council of a place called Dry Needle, a place she hoped was real. A fine, pale line, thin as a thread, marked the skin of her left wrist. She unconsciously covered it with her other hand. It was a reminder of why she was here, rattling toward the horizon in a box on wheels. It was the signature of her uncle, Barnaby Pike, a man whose greed was a form of suffocation. He had wanted her inheritance, and the husband he had chosen for her was simply the key to the lockbox. Lena had chosen the dust instead. She had chosen the unknown over the certainty of a gilded cage. Freedom. She was learning. Tasted a lot like thirst. Across from her, a drummer in a sweat-stained collar snored with his mouth open. Beside him, a woman with a face like a dried apple fanned herself with a tattered paper fan, her eyes closed against the glare. Lena was the only one watching the land, and she was not the only one. Riding alongside the stagecoach was a Navajo man. He had joined them at the last stop, a silent agreement made with the driver. He rode a sturdy paint horse that moved with an economy of motion, perfectly suited to the terrain. The man himself was the same. He was older than her, perhaps past 30, with a face that seemed carved from the same red rock as the mesas. He wore simple buckskin, and a single braid of dark hair was tied with a leather thong. He had not spoken a word, but his eyes missed nothing. They swept the horizon, the ground, the sky. In a constant, fluid assessment, Lena had heard the driver call him Chi. He was their guide through this territory, a place where trails could vanish overnight. She saw a gourd canteen at his hip, its surface smooth and dark with use. It seemed a fragile thing to hold a life in this desiccated world. The tension began as a subtle shift in the air. The trail narrowed, winding up into a series of low hills, a pass the driver had called Coyote Pass. The heat seemed to intensify, bouncing off the canyon walls. Chi subtly urged his horse closer to the lead team of the coach. His posture had not changed, but Lena felt an alertness radiate from him, a stillness that was more potent than any movement. The horses felt it too. Their ears twitched, and the led horse tossed its head with a nervous snort. Then came the sound, a sharp crack that was not a rock displaced by an iron-shod wheel. It was a rifle shot. The drummer jolted awake with a sputtering cry. The woman's fan froze mid-swoop. Another shot splintered the wood of the coach. Inches from Lena's head, she flinched back, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Shouts erupted from the rocks above them. Figures rose, their faces covered with bandanas. Robbers! The word screamed in Lena's mind. A primal fear she had only ever read about in dime novels. This was not a story. The smell of gunpowder was sharp and real. The driver cursed, whipping the horses into a panicked gallop. The coach lurched violently, throwing Lena against the snoring drummer. Outside, Chi moved like a wraith. He had his own rifle out, firing not at the men on the rocks, but at the ground near their feet, kicking up dust and creating confusion. He was not trying to kill them. He was trying to push them back. but the horses were blind with terror. They veered wildly, pulling the coach off the trail. The left wheels scraped against the rock wall of the pass with a scream of tortured wood and metal. The right side lifted, hanging over an abyss. Lena saw the ground disappear from her window, replaced by a dizzying expanse of empty air and jagged rock far below. The driver was shouting, sawing at the reins, but it was useless. The coach tilted further, groaning as its frame twisted. The door flew open. Lena lost her grip, her body sliding across the seat. The drummer yelled, trying to grab her, but his hands found only air. She was falling. A hand clamped around her arm like a vice. It was not the drummer. It was Chi. He was suddenly there, leaning from his saddle, his body a bridge between her and the fall. His grip was immensely strong, his face set in a mask of intense concentration. He pulled, and the strain in his arm was a living thing. For a moment, they were balanced on the knife edge of disaster. The coach gave a final, terrible shudder and pitched over the side, its weight dragging the terrified horses with it. Chi's horse scrambled for purchase, its hooves skittering on the loose rock, with a final, desperate heave. He pulled Lena clear, tumbling from his own saddle to land with her in the red dirt of the trail. They rolled, a tangle of limbs and dust, coming to a stop just feet from the edge. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the fading echo of the crash below. She lay on the ground, the sharp edges of gravel digging into her back, staring up at the empty blue sky. She was alive. Footsteps crunched on the trail, approaching them. Lena pushed herself up, her body trembling. The masked men were coming down from the rocks, their rifles held loosely but ready. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her shock. They had survived the fall only to face the robbers. Chi was already on his feet, placing himself between her and the approaching men. He stood with a calm that seemed impossible, his rifle held at his side but not aimed. He was watching them. His eyes narrowed. Lena saw one of the men limp slightly. Another wore a brass pin on his vest, a simple star design. They were not looking at her jewelry or the strong box that had gone over the cliff with the coach. They were looking at Chi, then at her, with a strange calculation. Chi spoke, his voice low and steady, not meant for her but for the men. He asked what they wanted. The leader, a big man with a rifle that looked new, laughed without humor. He said it was just a simple robbery gone wrong. He told them to stay put. But Chi's eyes were not on the man's face. They were on the ground, scanning the chaotic mess of hoofprints left by the panicked horses. He went still. He had seen something that changed the meaning of everything. Lena followed his gaze and saw nothing but scuffed dirt. Before the leader could speak again, Chi grabbed her hand. His touch was not gentle, but it was certain. He told her to run. He pulled her away from the men, not back down the trail, but straight toward the sheer rock face of the canyon wall. For a terrifying second, Lena thought he meant to jump. Then she saw it, a dark slit in the rock, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, hidden by a curtain of long-dead vines. The robbers shouted, raising their rifles. A bullet whined past Lena's ear. Chi shoved her toward the opening without looking back. She scrambled inside, the rough stone scraping her arms. He followed a moment later, just as another bullet ricocheted off the rock where he had been standing. The crevice was dark and cool. It smelled of damp earth and stone. They were safe, for now. The opening was too narrow for the men to follow easily, and their horses were useless. They could hear the men shouting outside, their voices muffled and distant. Lena leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. Her whole body ached. She looked at the man beside her, a silhouette in the dim light. He had saved her life. He was a stranger. Yet in the space of a few minutes, she owed him everything. She asked him how he knew the passage was there. He replied that the land keeps its promises to those who listen. His words were few, but they carried weight. Then he told her what he had seen. It was not a robbery. He had found the tracks. The horses the men rode were shod with shoes bearing a small, clear stamp, a C and an S, copper star. The railroad. This was not a random act of violence. It was a message, staged to look like a bandit attack, designed to make the territory seem lawless and unsafe, designed to scare settlers into selling their land cheap to the advancing railroad. The realization settled over Lena, colder than the stone at her back. She had fled one kind of predator only to run straight into the jaws of another. The ambush, her near death, it was all a piece of a larger, crueler game. They waited in silence until the voices outside faded. When they finally emerged from the crevice, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers. The air was still. The dust had settled. Far below, a plume of smoke rose from the wreckage of the coach. There was nothing left to go back to. Chi pointed toward a distant notch in the mesas. He said Dry Needle was that way, a day's walk. He passed her the gourd canteen, and the water was cool and sweet. She looked from the trail ahead to the man beside her. His face was unreadable, but she saw in his eyes a deep and abiding patience, like the land itself. She had arrived in the West seeking freedom, a small patch of earth to call her own. She had found something else entirely, a conflict she did not understand, and a silent guide whose path was now intertwined with hers. In a land where the wind could erase the trail itself, a person could only hold on to a promise. The town of Dry Needle was less a town and more a suggestion. A handful of weathered buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the vast, indifferent landscape. There was a saloon with swinging doors that creaked in the constant wind, a general store, and the combined post office and stagecoach depot. Chi led Leena not to any of these, but to a long, low adobe building from which the smell of coffee and frying bacon escaped. A sign painted in neat letters read Alma's Eatery. Inside, the air was warm and shaded. A woman with kind eyes and hair woven into a thick, graying braid looked up from behind a counter. This was Alma Reyes. Her eatery was the heart of Dry Needle, the place where news arrived before the mail and where worries were smoothed over with a hot meal. Chi spoke to her in a low voice, a mix of Spanish and English. Alma's gaze softened as she looked at Lena, taking in her dusty dress and exhausted posture. She simply nodded, gesturing to a small, clean table in the corner. Food appeared without Lena having to ask. A plate of beans, fresh tortillas, and a cup of coffee that was more chicory than bean but was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. While she ate, a man came in, pinning a notice to a board on the wall. He was young, with a serious face and a deputy's star on his vest that he seemed to still be growing into. This was Joel McKinnon. He saw Lena and Chi and walked over, his expression carefully neutral. Chi recounted the events at Coyote Pass, his words clipped and precise. He mentioned the horseshoe marks. Joel McKinnon's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger in his otherwise calm eyes. He had heard rumors of the Copper Star Railroad's tactics, but this was the first real evidence. He promised to ride out and investigate, though his tone suggested he did not expect to find much the railroad did not want found. He then looked at Lena, his gaze professional but not unkind. He had been told to expect a new schoolteacher. He confirmed her letter, now smudged and creased, had been the only thing recovered from the driver's personal effects. The town council, he explained, was mostly just Alma and the blacksmith. They had secured a place for the school. He would show her. The school was a derelict warehouse at the edge of town, smelling of dust and forgotten grain. Its one redeeming feature was the light that streamed through the high, dirty windows. The children were already there, a small, hesitant cluster of faces, Mexican children with dark, curious eyes sat beside fair-haired Anglo children whose parents worked the small ranches nearby, and sitting slightly apart were the Dine children, their expressions watchful and silent. They had been brought in from the surrounding lands by parents who hoped a white education was a shield against a changing world. There were no desks, No slates, no books. Her supplies had been in the coach. For a moment, despair washed over Lena, a cold tide that threatened to pull her under. She had run so far only to arrive with nothing. But then she looked at the children's faces, at the flicker of hope in their eyes. She could not fail them. Her blackboard became an old door, salvaged from a collapsed shed, which Joel helped her paint with a mixture of soot and pitch. Her chalk was a piece of limestone she found in a dry wash, which she taught the older boys how to crush into a usable powder. Lessons began with what they had: the world outside the warehouse door. They learned numbers by counting the lizards that skittered across the sun-baked earth and letters by tracing them in the red dust. One afternoon, a woman with a brisk walk and a twinkle in her eye appeared at the door. She was carrying a clay pot. This was Hattie Bell, a widow who lived just outside of town and kept bees. Her face was a roadmap of smiles and sorrows, and she spoke with a dry wit that Lena found instantly comforting. Hattie had heard about the new teacher and had brought a gift of honey. She surveyed the makeshift classroom, her gaze missing nothing. She remarked that trying to teach children without books was like trying to herd cats in a windstorm, but she admired the effort. She became Lena's first and most staunch ally. Her small house, surrounded by the orderly, humming hives, became a refuge for Lena. The bees, Hattie would say, understood community. Every bee had a job, and the hive was stronger for it. She would point out the quiet, ceaseless labor, the way they built something beautiful and lasting out of nectar and pollen. It was a lesson in persistence, a small, buzzing bastion of order in a chaotic world. The honey itself was a balm, which Lena learned to use on the children's scrapes and sunburns. The classroom, however, was not a sanctuary from the world's troubles. Lena noticed quickly that the Diney children would not speak their own language. If a word slipped out, they would fall silent, their eyes darting around as if expecting a blow. An older Anglo boy confirmed that the previous teacher, a stern man from back east, had forbidden it. Lena's heart ached for them. To steal a child's words was to steal a piece of their soul. So she devised a game. She called it a word song. During reading lessons, she would have the children whisper words. She would say the English word, tree, and encourage the dying children to whisper their word for it, tis. It was a quiet rebellion, a murmur of defiance in the dusty air. The children's faces, at first fearful, slowly blossomed with shy smiles. They were seen. Their world was not being erased. Chi was not a permanent fixture in Dry Needle. His life was on the trails, guiding supply wagons and traders through the territory. But his path seemed to cross through the small town more often than strictly necessary. He would appear at the open warehouse door, a silent observer leaning against the frame. He never stayed long. He would claim he was there to return a pencil a child had supposedly dropped near the trail, or to ask about the condition of the northern wash. But his eyes were always on Lena. He watched her patience with a struggling student, the quick, encouraging smile she offered, the determined set of her jaw as she scrubbed the soot-blackened door clean each afternoon. He said little, but his presence was a steadying thing, a quiet acknowledgement of the world she was trying to build. This fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of Foreman Rusk. He was a big man who seemed to take up more space than he was due. His face perpetually flushed with sun and impatience. He rode into town with a handful of hard-faced men, their saddles all bearing the Copper Star brand. He did not bother with pleasantries. He strode into Alma's eatery during the midday meal, a map in his hand. He unrolled it on a table, the paper weighted down with a dirty thumb. He announced that the Copper Star was putting its new station right here. The line would cut directly across the communal grazing lands used by the town's ranchers and the Dinini. He needed deeds signed over. The price he offered was an insult. When the men gathered in the eatery began to mutter in protest, Rusk's face hardened. He looked around the room, his eyes cold. He said it would be a shame if a place like Dry Needle started having accidents. A fire, maybe, or a well that suddenly went bad. His threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous as smoke. After he left, a heavy silence filled the eatery. The seeds of conflict had been sown. Lena felt a familiar dread coil in her stomach. It was the same feeling she'd had in her uncle's house, the feeling of being trapped, of having her choices taken away by a powerful, ruthless man. She had run across a continent to escape that feeling, and here it was again. She wanted to lean on someone, to ask Joel McKinnon to simply arrest the man, to ask Chi to make him disappear. But she was afraid. Trusting someone else with her safety had cost her dearly before. She had to stand on her own. Not far from the town, in the shade of a small hogan, Chi sat with an elder named Hastian Nez. The old man's face was a beautiful, intricate story, his hands gnarled but steady as he wove a small ceremonial basket. Chi told him about the railroad, about the man named Rusk, about the teacher in the warehouse. Hastian Nez listened without interruption, his eyes on his work. The long walk had taught their people about promises made of smoke and the true weight of the earth beneath their feet. He told Chi that a man cannot outrun his own shadow. The past was always there. The question was whether you let it drag you down or teach you where to find solid ground. He spoke of Hozo, of walking in beauty and balance. Balance was not the absence of conflict. It was the strength to face it without losing yourself. He warned Chi against closing his heart. A man who carries too much alone will eventually break. That evening, as the sun set and painted the mesas in hues of orange and purple, Lena stood in the doorway of her school. The children were gone, but the air still held the faint echo of their voices. She felt torn. Part of her wanted to flee again, to find a place the world had not yet reached with its greed, but another part, a stronger part, looked at the crude blackboard and the neat rows of pebbles the children used for counting. This was hers. She had made it from nothing, and she would not let it be taken away. She was afraid of being controlled, but she was starting to learn that real freedom was not about being alone. It was about choosing what and who was worth fighting for. The sound came with the dawn. It was a relentless, metallic rhythm that rolled across the plains and settled over Dry Needle like a shroud. A heavy, two-beat pulse of sledgehammers striking steel spikes. The men of the Copper Star Railroad had made their camp a few miles east of town, and with every sunrise, their work began. They felled the old cottonwoods that grew along the dry washes, stripping the land of its shade and its grace, leaving behind pale, naked stumps like tombstones. The sound of their axes was a sharp counterpoint to the dull thud of the hammers, a constant reminder of Foreman Rusk's promise of progress, a promise that felt more like a threat. In the makeshift schoolhouse, Lena found herself raising her voice to be heard over the noise. The children were distracted, their eyes often drifting toward the open door, as if the sound itself were a physical presence coming to call them out. She tried to make a game of it, telling them it was the sound of giants building a bridge to the moon. But the younger ones were frightened, and the older ones knew better. They knew it was the sound of change, and in this land, change was rarely a gentle thing. The first accident happened to Hattie Bell. She arrived at the school one morning not with her usual brisk stride and witty remark, but with a slow, heavy step, a smudge of soot on her cheek. She carried an empty honey pot. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet and brittle. Someone had come in the night. They had not stolen anything. They had kicked over the hives, the carefully tended homes of her bees, and set them on fire. She spoke of the smell, of burned wood and caramelized honey, a sweet, sickening perfume of destruction. The surviving bees, she said, were a confused, angry cloud. Their intricate world of order and work shattered into chaos. Lena's heart clenched. It was not just wood and wax that had been burned. It was a piece of the town's soul. Hattie's bees were a symbol of tireless creation, and their ruin felt like a personal violation to everyone. A few days later, it was Alma's turn. The morning rush at the eatery was interrupted when a rancher who had stopped to water his horse came stumbling back in, choking and spitting. The water from the public well, the town's main source of life, was brackish and oily. Alma went out herself, drawing a bucket. The water smelled foul, coated with a greasy film that shimmered in the sunlight. Someone had poured kerosene into it. The well was poisoned. For the rest of the day, people came to Alma with their buckets, but she could only offer them coffee from her own private cistern, her face a mask of weary anger. The message was clear. The railroad could not only take your livelihood, they could poison the very water you drank. Lena felt the fear in town solidify into something ugly. People started looking at their neighbors with suspicion. Old arguments flared. The pressure was working. Some began to mutter that perhaps selling to the railroad was not such a bad idea after all. Anything for a quiet life. The final blow landed directly on Lena. She arrived at the warehouse one morning to find the wooden bar across the door splintered. Inside, a cold fury rose in her throat, choking off the air. Her blackboard. The old door she had so painstakingly painted and smoothed had been torn from its hinges and smashed. The pieces lay on the dirt floor like the remnants of a shipwreck. Her precious chalk, the limestone powder she and the children had ground by hand, was scattered across the wreckage. A fine white dust like snow on a battlefield. This was not random. This was for her. It was a message that her small attempt to build something here, to bring knowledge and hope into this dusty corner of the world, was not welcome. Deputy Joel McKinnon came and looked at each scene. He was methodical, his face grim. He did not say much, but he missed little. At Hattie's, he found a discarded cigar butt, a brand only sold at the railroad camp commissary. Near Alma's well, half hidden in the dirt, he discovered a boot print. It was a large print, with a worn heel on which a single, distinctive letter was still visible. An R. He took a careful sketch of it in his notebook. He knew, as did everyone, that it stood for Rusk. Armed with his notes, he went to see the town sheriff, an older man with a paunch and eyes that never quite met anyone else's. Joel laid out his evidence on the sheriff's dusty desk. The sheriff listened, picking at his teeth with a sliver of wood. When Joel finished, the older man sighed. A long, theatrical sound of boredom. He told Joel he was seeing ghosts. A cigar butt proved nothing. A boot print could belong to anyone named Robert or Richard. He took Joel's report, folded it without reading it, and tucked it into a drawer. He said he would look into it. Joel knew then that the report would be lost, the evidence forgotten. The Law and Dry Needle had been bought and paid for by the Copper Star. That evening, as Lena was sweeping the last of the white dust from the floor of her ruined school, Chi appeared. He had been away, guiding a wagon train, but he had heard the news. He did not offer words of sympathy. He walked to the remnants of the blackboard and examined the broken wood. Then he looked at Lena, his gaze steady. He said he would be back. He returned an hour later and asked her to walk with him. He led her away from the town, out onto the plain where the hammering had finally ceased for the night. He stopped near a thicket of mesquite. He pointed to the ground. At first, she saw only a confusion of tracks, but he knelt, his finger tracing patterns in the dirt that she could not see. He explained that a horse had stood here, tied to a branch, for some time, and here, beside it, another horse. He showed her the impressions of the shoes. One set was smooth, worn down in a way that was common for local horses. The other set was sharper, with a small, almost invisible nick on the left foreshoe. It was a maker's mark, one he recognized from the railroad's blacksmith. Then he pointed to a patch of disturbed earth. This, he said, was where the rider had changed the shoes on his horse, putting on the worn local set before riding toward Hattie Bell's property. After the fire, the rider had returned here and put the railroad shoes back on. It was a clear, deliberate act of deception, a stage play written in the dust. A hot, clean anger burned through Lena's fear. They had proof. She wanted to march back into town, gather everyone in Alma's eatery, and tell them what she had found. She wanted to expose the sheriff, to call Rusk a coward and a liar to his face. She told Chi her plan. He listened, his expression unchanging. When she finished, he shook his head. Just once. He told her that words are wind. Their story, a teacher and a Navajo guide, would be dismissed. Rusk would deny it. The sheriff would laugh. They would say he was a troublemaker, and she was a hysterical woman. They needed more. They needed something no one could deny. Lena's frustration boiled over. She accused him of being too cautious, of being afraid to fight. His eyes hardened. He told her he was not afraid of fighting. He was afraid of losing. He had seen what happened when his people fought with passion but without a plan. He would not make that mistake. "First, you gather the evidence," he said. "Then you speak." His quiet certainty was more powerful than her anger. She saw the wisdom in it, but it chafed against her need for immediate justice. An uneasy truce settled between them. She knew he was right. They needed more than hoofprints in the dust. They needed something from the camp itself. A payroll ledger, a shipping manifest, something with Rusk's name on it. And so, a new, far more dangerous plan was born. They would go to the lion's den themselves. They waited until the moon was down, a sliver of silver hidden by the clouds. The railroad camp was a sprawling, chaotic collection of tents and rough shacks, lit by flickering lanterns and a few large bonfires. The smell of unwashed men, cheap whiskey, and machine oil hung heavy in the air. They moved like shadows along the edge of the camp, Chi in the lead, his every step silent and sure. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs, but she focused on placing her feet exactly where he placed his. He led her to a large supply tent at the back of the camp, away from the main bonfires. This was where the foreman's office would be, where the books were kept. They were 50 yards away when Chi suddenly stopped. He put a hand on her arm, pulling her down behind a stack of new railroad ties. He did not look at the camp. He looked up at the sky, his head tilted, sniffing the air. He told her a storm was coming, a dust storm. She could see nothing but stars, could feel nothing but the same dry breeze. He told her to listen, not with her ears, but with her skin, to smell. The air, he explained, was changing. The scent of dust was growing stronger, and beneath it, a faint, clean smell, the smell of rain falling on dry earth, miles and miles away. The wind carried the story of the weather that was coming. Even as he spoke, the breeze quickened. The distant stars began to blur. A low moaning sound started, the voice of the rising wind. Within minutes, the world dissolved into a howling, blinding chaos of red sand. The lanterns in the camp vanished. Shouts were swallowed by the roar of the storm. Chi grabbed her hand and pulled her away from the camp, into the teeth of the wind. He seemed to know where he was going, even in the suffocating darkness. He led her to a low outcropping of rock, to a dark opening she never would have seen. It was a small cave, barely more than a hollow in the rock. They scrambled inside, out of the screaming wind. The silence in the cave was absolute, a profound quiet that pressed in on them after the fury outside. They could hear the storm raging, but it was a muffled, distant thunder. They were safe, trapped, but safe. They sat for a long time without speaking, their breathing slowly returning to normal. In the darkness, the world was reduced to just the two of them. Lena could feel the warmth of his body next to hers. She finally broke the silence, her voice a little shaky. She said that in Boston. She had thought a storm was just rain. He did not laugh. He said that here, the land speaks in many voices. Wind, rock, water. You only have to learn how to listen. To fill the silence, she started talking about her school, about how a simple piece of chalk was her only tool, her only weapon. She asked him what he carried. He pulled out a long hunting knife, its blade catching a faint glimmer of light from the cave opening. He said it was for skinning game, cutting rope, making a shelter, a tool for survival. A small smile touched her lips. She said it was funny. Her chalk was for building things up, for making marks that could teach and inspire. His knife was for taking things apart, for cutting away what was not needed. He considered this. Then he said that sometimes you have to cut the dead wood away before something new can grow. The storm raged for what felt like hours. In their small shelter, they were an island in a sea of violent weather. She found herself teasing him about how sparingly he used words. She told him he saved them up like a miser hoarding coins. He looked at her, and in the deep gloom, she saw the corners of his eyes crinkle. It was almost a smile. He said words were heavy. It was better to carry only what you need. As the wind finally began to subside, its roar diminishing to a mournful sigh, they heard a new sound, a voice, slurred by drink and fear, carried on the last gusts of wind. It was coming from nearby, a man stumbling through the aftermath of the storm. They peered out of the cave. A lone railroad worker was staggering toward their rock, using it for shelter. He was holding a bottle and muttering to himself. He was drunk and he was angry. They held their breath, sinking back into the shadows. The man collapsed at the base of their rock, not 10 feet away. He took a long swallow from his bottle and began to rant to the empty desert. He cursed Foreman Rusk, cursed his greed, his cruelty. And then he said the words that made Lena's blood run cold. He slurred that Rusk was a fool, that this new plan was crazy. Burning down the schoolhouse, that was going too far, just to scare people, and then he was going to blame it on the Navajo. The drunkard moaned. He said Rusk was going to start a war just to get his cursed land. Lena looked at Chi in the darkness. His face was like carved stone. They had found their proof. It was not a ledger or a manifest. It was a man, a drunken, terrified witness who had just delivered the entire plot into their hands. The storm had passed, but a new and more dangerous one was about to break. The night in Dry Needle was rarely silent. There was the constant whisper of the wind, the distant cry of a coyote, the lonely sound of the piano from the saloon. But this was a new sound, a hungry sound. It began as a low crackle, like bacon in a skillet, and grew into a roar that shook the windows in their frames. Then came the light, a malevolent orange glow that painted the undersides of the clouds and pulsed against the darkness. Lena woke with a gasp, her heart instantly racing. Smoke. She smelled smoke, thick and acrid, the scent of pine and old dust burning. She threw on her dress and ran out of the small room she rented behind Hattie's house. The light was coming from the edge of town, from her school. A wave of sickness and fury washed over her. The drunkard's words from the storm. It was happening. Rusk was making good on his threat. People were spilling from their homes, their faces pale and horrified in the flickering light. The warehouse was an inferno. Flames licked up the dry timber walls and poured from the high windows. A terrible, beautiful spectacle of destruction. For a moment, Lena was paralyzed by the sheer scale of it, the finality. Everything she had built was turning to ash. Then she saw the children. They were huddled with their parents, their small faces streaked with tears as they watched their school burn. That sight broke her paralysis. She would not let Rusk take everything. Alma Reyes was already there, shouting orders, organizing a bucket brigade from her cistern. Hattie Bell, her face set like granite, was right beside her. Lena ran to join them. The heat was a physical blow, driving them back. It was hopeless to save the building, but not everything was inside. She yelled over the roar of the fire. The books, there were only a dozen, precious and worn, gifts from a traveling preacher, and the blackboard. They had just finished building a new one, a heavy slab of slate framed with cottonwood, a gift from the town blacksmith. It was propped against the outside wall, waiting to be installed. Chi was suddenly there, emerging from the shadows as if the fire itself had summoned him. He saw what Lena was looking at. Without a word, he moved toward the burning wall. The heat was immense. He ignored it. He grabbed one end of the heavy blackboard. Lena, Alma, and 2 ranchers grabbed the other side. It was scorching hot, the wood of the frame already beginning to smolder. They heaved, their muscles straining, and dragged it away from the flames, yard by painful yard, until it was safe in the middle of the street. Hattie organized the older children, having them douse the precious books with water from the buckets to save them from the flying embers. They worked with a grim, silent efficiency, a small army fighting a battle they had already lost, but fighting it all the same. As Lena stood, catching her breath, her hands raw and her face stinging from the heat, she saw Deputy Joel McKinnon ride up, his horse shying from the flames. His eyes met hers, and he did not need to ask. He knew who was responsible. He saw Chi gesture with his head toward the east, toward the railroad camp. 2 figures on horseback were visible for a moment, silhouetted against the flames, before they spurred their mounts and disappeared into the night. Joel and Chi exchanged a single look of understanding. Joel drew his pistol. Chi vaulted onto his own horse, which had been tethered nearby. Together, they galloped off into the darkness, in pursuit of the arsonists. The fire raged for another hour before it began to consume itself, the roof collapsing in a shower of sparks that spiraled into the smoke-choked sky. The townspeople stood in a weary, silent circle, their faces grimy, their expressions a mixture of anger and despair. A woman's scream cut through the exhausted quiet. It was a mother's scream, sharp with terror. Lena turned to see a small group clustered together. A dying woman was on her knees, cradling her son. It was Tazi, a bright, quiet boy of 7 who loved to draw pictures of horses in the dust. His small body was convulsing. He was trying to breathe, but only a terrible, high-pitched wheezing sound came out. His face was a frightening shade of blue. The smoke had gotten to him, closing off his throat. Someone shouted for the doctor. The cry was taken up by others. Sage Walker. The town's only doctor was a man who fought his own demons with a bottle, a brilliant field surgeon from the war who was now slowly pickling himself in whiskey. Hattie ran to fetch him. He arrived moments later, stumbling slightly, his hair unkempt. His hands, Lena noticed with a sinking heart, were trembling. But as he knelt beside the boy, a profound change came over him. The bleary, unfocused look in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sharp, intense clarity. The trembling in his hands did not stop, but it seemed to become controlled, a hum of nervous energy he was channeling. He felt the boy's throat, listened to the awful sound of his breathing. "There is no time," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "He is choking. I have to open his windpipe." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The boy's mother began to keen, a low, mournful sound. Sage Walker looked at her, his gaze direct and surprisingly gentle. "Trust me," he said. "It is his only chance." He looked around. "I need a clean cloth, and a knife, and honey." Alma produced a clean dish towel from her apron. Chi's hunting knife appeared in someone's hand. Hattie ran and returned with a pot of her golden honey. Sage Walker took the knife. He poured whiskey from a flask over the blade. Then over his own trembling hands, he took a deep breath, and for a single, terrifying moment, the knife was still. He made a swift, precise cut in the boy's throat, a small, dark line from which no blood came. He gently inserted the handle of the knife to hold the opening clear. Taji's small body gave a final, violent shudder, and then a miracle. Air rushed into the opening, a ragged, whistling breath, but it was a breath. The blue tinge in his lips began to recede. Sage Walker worked quickly, applying a smear of Hattie's honey to the wound with a clean finger. A folk remedy he knew worked as well as any medicine to prevent infection. He covered the opening with a piece of the cloth. The boy was breathing. He was alive. Sage Walker sat back on his heels, and the trembling returned to his hands, more violently this time. The intense focus left his eyes, and he was just a drunk, tired old man again. but he had saved a life. The next morning, the rising sun revealed the full extent of the devastation. The schoolhouse was a blackened skeleton, a smoking ruin that smelled of wet ash and despair. The townspeople gathered, their faces grim. Foreman Rusk rode into the center of the square, his face a mask of concern. He dismounted, shaking his head in mock sadness. He spoke in a loud, carrying voice, ensuring everyone could hear. He called it a tragedy, a terrible, lawless act. Then he turned, his eyes sweeping over the dying families who stood silently on the edge of the crowd. "It is a known fact," Rusk declared, "that some of the natives have been unhappy. They resist progress. It is a sad thing when people turn on those who are trying to help them. They burn down a school for their own children to make a point." The poison in his words spread through the crowd. Some people nodded. It was an easy answer. It fit with the old, ugly prejudices that were never far from the surface. The dying families did not react, their faces impassive. But Lena saw the hurt and anger in their eyes. She could not stay silent. She felt a lifetime of being quiet, of swallowing injustice, fall away from her. She stepped forward from the crowd, into the open space in front of Rusk. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was clear and carried in the morning air. "That is a lie," she said. Rusk turned to her, a sneer on his face. "The little schoolteacher, what would you know about it?" She held up her hand. In her palm was a small, blackened piece of metal. It was a rivet head, the kind used in heavy construction. She had found it in the ashes, near where the fire had started. Its shape preserved in the hard-packed earth, stamped into its surface. Still faintly visible through the soot were two letters, CS. "I found this where the fire was set," she announced. "It did not come from the schoolhouse. It came from the Copper Star Railroad." A murmur went through the crowd. People pushed forward to see. The sheriff stepped up, took the rivet, and squinted at it. He grunted and put it in his pocket, his face unreadable. Rusk's face flushed a dark red. He called her a liar and a troublemaker. But his denials were too loud, too defensive. The seed of doubt had been planted. The railroad's response was swift and cunning. The next day, a notice was posted outside the general store. The Copper Star was hiring local men, good wages, paid in cash at the end of each day. It was a brilliant, cruel move. It split the town, for a family struggling to feed their children. The offer of cash was a temptation too great to ignore. Men who had stood with their neighbors in the bucket brigade now avoided their eyes in the street, on their way to work for the very company that was trying to destroy them. In the chaos of the fire's aftermath, Chi had felt the pull of a darker justice. From the ridge where he and Joel had chased the arsonists, they had looked down on the railroad camp. Rusk had been there, standing by a fire, receiving the report from the two men they had pursued. For a full minute, Rusk had been perfectly framed in the sights of Chi's rifle. It would have been an easy shot. A part of him, a part forged in the bitterness of the long walk and the memory of his people's suffering, had screamed for him to pull the trigger, to end it, to deliver the only kind of justice a man like Rusk would understand. But he had seen the cost of that kind of justice. He had seen how violence only ever birthed more violence. Hasty and Nez's words about balance, about walking the right path, echoed in his mind. He had slowly, deliberately lowered his rifle. Vengeance was a fire that consumed the one who wielded it. Justice had to be built, slowly and carefully, like a stone wall. In the days that followed, Lena refused to be defeated. With the help of Hattie, Alma, and the families who remained loyal, she began to rebuild. They cleared the wreckage of the warehouse. They could not rebuild the structure, but one wall, made of thick adobe brick, had survived the flames. Against this wall, they hung the blackboard. It was blackened around the edges, the cottonwood frame deeply charred, a permanent scar. But the slate was intact. Lena picked up a piece of limestone and wrote on its surface. The letters stood out, stark and white against the dark, scorched slate. Knowledge was threatened by fire, she told the children, but it is still here. A week after the fire, the mail rider brought a letter. It was addressed to Lena, the envelope crisp and official-looking, a stark contrast to the dusty, makeshift world she now inhabited. The postmark was from Boston. Her blood ran cold as she saw the return address. It was from the law offices of Barnaby Pike. She opened it with trembling fingers. It was not a letter. It was a legal summons. Her uncle was formally accusing her of absconding with family property, namely, herself, as he was her legal guardian. He was demanding her immediate return to Boston to face the charges. It was a trap, a legal cage designed to drag her back under his control. The fight for Dry Needle was now entangled with the fight for her own life. She stood there, the papers shaking in her hand, the world seeming to shrink around her. She was alone, cornered by two different enemies, one in front of her and one reaching for her from 1,000 miles away. Chi walked up to her then. He had seen the look on her face. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply looked at the letter, then at her. His gaze was steady, a point of stillness in her swirling fear. "I will take you," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement, a promise, and in that moment, Lena knew she was not entirely alone after all. The path ahead was uncertain and dangerous, but for the first time, she would not be walking it by herself. They left Dry Needle under a sky the color of a faded bruise before the sun had crested the eastern mesas. The salt trail was not a road but a memory of one, a path etched into the land by generations of traders and nomads. It led them away from the constant, rhythmic hammering of the railroad and into a profound silence, a world of shimmering heat and cracked earth. The trail earned its name from the vast, white salt flats it crossed, where the ground crunched under the horses' hooves and the air tasted of brine and dust. In this empty quarter, water was not a resource, it was a religion. Every drop in cheese-gourd canteen was a prayer against a thirsty death. Lena was not a natural rider. She had learned the basics in a manicured Boston park, on a placid mare that had all the spirit of a rocking horse. Chi's spare horse, a tough, independent gelding, was another matter entirely. It had its own ideas about the proper pace and the best path around a patch of prickly pear. For 2 days, Lena bounced and jolted, her muscles screaming in protest, her hands raw from gripping the reins. Chi rode ahead, a silent, patient guide, never commenting on her struggles, though she often felt the ghost of a smile on his face when he turned to look back at her. Her downfall came in the form of a startled jackrabbit. It burst from a clump of sagebrush, a brown blur of panicked energy. Lena's horse shied violently, and she, in a moment of lost balance, went tumbling from the saddle. She did not have time to cry out. She landed with a soft, yet distinctly unpleasant, series of thuds in a large, sprawling cholla cactus. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, a strange sense of indignity overriding the pain. She was covered in fine, needle-like spines, a human pincushion. Chi was off his horse in an instant. He walked over, his expression unreadable, and looked down at her predicament. He surveyed the scene, taking in her undignified sprawl and the bristling cactus. A slow crinkle formed at the corners of his eyes. "Good land," he said, his voice completely serious. "Soft fall." Lena stared at him, and then a bubble of laughter, sharp and slightly hysterical, escaped her. She laughed until tears ran down her dusty cheeks, a release of all the tension and fear and soreness of the past few days. He waited until she was finished, then methodically began to pick the spines from her clothes and skin with the tip of his knife, his touch surprisingly gentle. The small, shared moment of humor did more to bridge the distance between them than any long conversation could have. 2 days later, they found the wagon. It was mired to its axles in the muddy bottom of a wash that had, until a recent, freakish thunderstorm, been bone dry. A family of freedmen, a man, his wife, and their 3 children were struggling to dig the wheels out with their bare hands, their efforts only sinking it deeper. Their clothes were worn, their faces etched with exhaustion, but their eyes held a fierce, unbreakable pride. Chi and Lena did not hesitate. They dismounted and went to help. With the strength of their horses and some carefully placed logs for leverage, they managed to free the wagon after an hour of grueling work. The man, whose name was Moses, clasped Chi's hand with a gratitude that needed no words. His wife, Sarah, insisted on sharing what little food they had. They sat together in the shade of the wagon and ate hot, gritty cornbread that tasted to Lena like the finest cake. Moses told them they were heading for a small settlement in the next territory, a place where black families were buying their own land. He spoke of the freedom they were seeking, not a freedom given, but one made, built with sweat and calloused hands. Lena listened, the summons from her uncle feeling like a lead weight in her saddlebag. Her own flight, her search for a life free from control, felt small and simple compared to the generations of struggle she heard in Moses' voice. As they parted ways, Sarah pressed a small bundle of dried herbs into Lena's hand. For the journey, she said, "May your path be clear." That night, they made camp high on a mesa, a flat-topped mountain that offered a panoramic view of the world. The sky was a vast bowl of stars, so bright they seemed close enough to touch. A small fire of dried mesquite crackled between them, holding the deep desert chill at bay. In the immensity of the silence, Lena felt a sense of both peace and unease. She asked Chi about the stories of this land, the ones the children in Dry Needle sometimes whispered about when they thought she was not listening. She asked about the shapeshifters, the ones they called skinwalkers. A subtle change came over Chi. He did not dismiss her question. He grew very still, his eyes on the fire. He told her that there are some stories that are not for telling. They have power, he said, and that power is not to be played with. He explained that respect was the most important rule in this land. Respect for the wind, for the water, for the spirits that walked in the darkness. His tone was not menacing, but it drew a clear line she knew not to cross. He then reached into a small pouch at his belt and took out a pinch of blue cornmeal. He walked to the edge of the mesa and, with a soft murmur of words in his own language, scattered the meal to the 4 directions. It was a simple, quiet gesture, an offering to the land that sustained them, an acknowledgement that they were guests here, small and temporary beings in a place of ancient power. Lena watched him, understanding that she was seeing a piece of his world that few outsiders were ever privileged to witness. Their greatest test came the next day. The trail led them to a deep, narrow chasm, a violent slash in the earth hundreds of feet deep. The only way across was a rope bridge, a swaying, precarious structure of weathered planks and frayed-looking ropes, a relic from some long-forgotten survey team. The wind howled through the canyon, plucking at the bridge and making it dance in the empty air. Chi went first, moving with a fluid, confident grace, his weight balanced perfectly. He reached the other side and turned, waiting for her. Lena's mouth was dry. She looked down once, a mistake, and the world seemed to spin beneath her. She took a deep breath and started across, her eyes fixed on Chi, her hands gripping the rope so tightly her knuckles were white. She was halfway across when a gust of wind, stronger than the rest, slammed into the bridge. It swayed violently. A wooden plank beneath her foot, softened by rot, gave way with a sickening crack. Her foot plunged through the empty space. She cried out, her body lurching, her grip on the rope slipping. She was falling, but she was there. He moved faster than she would have thought possible, lunging back onto the bridge. His hands shot out and clamped around her wrist, his grip like iron. Her body dangled over the abyss, her entire weight held by his one arm. The wind roared around them. She could feel the strain in his muscles, the taut line of his body as he fought to keep them both from being pulled over the edge. She looked up, and their eyes met. In that moment, suspended between the sky and the jagged rocks below, there was no guide and no schoolteacher. There were only two people, holding onto each other for life. She saw no fear in his eyes, only a fierce, unwavering concentration. He held her gaze, and slowly, with a strength that seemed impossible, he began to pull her up. He did not speak. He just pulled. She scrambled for purchase with her free hand, her boots finding a solid plank. He hauled her the rest of the way, collapsing with her onto the relative safety of the rock ledge at the far end of the chasm. They lay there for a long moment, gasping for air, the adrenaline singing in their veins. His hand was still on her wrist. She could feel his pulse, a steady, powerful beat against her own frantic heartbeat. The tension of the moment had forged a new kind of bond between them, something deeper than companionship, a knowledge of shared mortality and absolute trust. They rested for an hour, letting the trembling in their limbs subside. It was then that they saw the bird. It was a homing pigeon, flying with a weary but determined beat of its wings. It circled once, then landed near them. A small, feathered messenger from another world. A tiny capsule was tied to its leg. Lena's hands shook as she carefully untied it and unrolled the tiny scroll of paper inside. The handwriting was Joel McKinnon's. The message was short, the words stark and brutal. Rusk is hiring gunmen, not railroad workers, but fighters. He is telling everyone you fled. He is waiting for you to be brought back. The summons is a trick. He plans to take you hostage, to force the town to sign the deeds. Do not come back. The piece of paper felt impossibly heavy in her hand. The world tilted on its axis. Her uncle, her legal troubles, the long journey to Boston, all of it evaporated. It had never been about her inheritance. It had been about the land. Barnaby Pike and Foreman Rusk were partners in the same cruel game, and she was just a pawn. They were using her to break the spirit of Dry Needle, to take the well, the grazing land, and the future of the children she had taught. She looked at Chi. He had read the message over her shoulder. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. His hand rested on the hilt of his knife. They had survived the salt trail, the thirst, the flash flood, the fall. They had come so far, only to be told to run farther. Lena looked back in the direction they had come, toward the small, dusty town that had become, against all odds, a home. She thought of Alma's quiet strength, Hattie's fierce loyalty, Joel's integrity, and the small, trusting faces of her students. She thought of the charred blackboard hanging on the one remaining wall. She looked at Chi, and he saw the decision in her eyes before she spoke the words. He nodded, his own choice already made. Their journey to Boston was over. A new one was just beginning. "We cannot let them burn the school again," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. They turned their horses around and started back, riding not toward safety, but toward the fight. The journey back was a silent, desperate race against a known threat. The land they had crossed with cautious exploration they now covered with grim urgency. Every rock and canyon that had seemed a thing of beauty on the way out now looked like a potential ambush point on the way back. They rode hard, pushing the horses, their face set against the wind. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer, and the dust was a constant, choking presence. There was no easy humor now, no time for lessons in tracking or reading the land. There was only the trail ahead and the knowledge of what awaited them in Dry Needle. On the third day of their return, the world began to change. The air, usually bone-dry and sharp with heat, grew heavy and thick. The sky, a relentless pale blue, began to curdle, streaks of gray and purple appearing on the western horizon. The wind shifted, losing its hot edge and carrying a new scent, the smell of damp earth and distant rain. Chi slowed his horse, his eyes on the sky, reading the clouds as he had once read the tracks in the dust. He told Lena they needed to find shelter. The rain when it came to this land, was rarely gentle. They found it in the skeletal remains of an old homestead, a place long since abandoned to the elements. All that was left was a crumbling adobe wall and a ramada, a simple sun shelter made of 4 upright posts with a roof of woven branches. It was not much, but it was cover. They unsaddled the horses and tethered them on the leeward side of the wall just as the first drops of rain began to fall. It did not begin as a storm. It was a soft, hissing sound, the whisper of a million tiny drops landing on the parched earth. The smell of creosote bush, released by the moisture, rose up, a sharp, clean perfume that was the very essence of the desert after a storm. The rain intensified, not with the violence of a thunderstorm, but with the steady, soaking persistence of a shower that meant to stay. It was a rare, precious gift to the land, a baptism for the dust. They huddled under the ramada, the water dripping through the branch roof in a dozen places, but leaving them a small, mostly dry island in the center. Chi built a tiny fire, no bigger than a man's 2 hands. Using dry wood he produced from a waterproof pouch, it gave off more warmth than light. A small, courageous flame against the gray, weeping afternoon. The sound of the rain created a world of its own, a curtain of water that cut them off from everything else. In the small, fire-lit space, the silence between them was different. It was not the silence of the trail, born of concentration and the need to conserve energy. It was an intimate quiet, a space for thoughts that were usually shouted down by the sun and the wind. Lena watched the flames, her arms wrapped around her knees. The journey, the danger, the message from Joel. It had all stripped away the last of her defenses. She was no longer just a schoolteacher from Boston. She was a woman who had fallen from a stagecoach, been shot at, crossed a chasm on a rope bridge, and was now riding back to face down a railroad baron's hired guns. And she was doing it all beside a man she barely knew, but whom she trusted with her life. The sight of his hands as he carefully added a twig to the fire, the quiet competence of his every move, unlocked something in her. It was the absolute safety she felt in his presence, a feeling she had never known before, and it made the memory of its opposite, the suffocating lack of safety in her uncle's house, rise up like a bitter taste in her mouth. She spoke, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the sound of the rain. He used the law. My uncle, he used it like a cage. Chi did not look at her, but she knew he was listening, his attention as focused as if he were tracking a mountain lion. She told him everything then, the words tumbling out in a soft, halting rush. She spoke of her small inheritance, and how her uncle, Barnaby Pike, had been appointed her guardian. She told him of the man Barnaby had chosen for her, a business associate of his, a man with moist hands and an avaricious smile. The marriage was just a transaction, a way for the 2 men to consolidate her assets. She was the property to be traded. My uncle told me it was my duty, she whispered to the fire. He said a woman's body was a vessel, an asset to be managed wisely. He told me what my husband would expect of me. He described things, and he told me not to be afraid of them, that it was natural, but it felt like the most unnatural thing in the world. She paused, taking a shaky breath. She could feel a hot blush of shame creep up her neck, even now, miles and years away from that stifling Boston parlor. I know nothing, she said, her voice dropping lower. About any of it. I was both afraid and ashamed of my own body. He made me feel that way, like it was something that did not belong to me, a thing to be bartered and used. She finally looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The truth of her fear, the core of it, rose in her throat. She stammered, "Virgin and shy." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and intensely vulnerable. Chi stopped tending the fire. He turned his head and looked directly at her. His face was calm, his eyes deep and serious. There was no pity in his expression, only a profound, quiet understanding. He held her gaze for a long moment. and then he gave a single, slow nod. "Then I will be gentle." A Navajo warrior nodded, "and yours for life." The words were a vow, spoken with a simplicity that made them more powerful than any flowery poetry. They were a promise of protection, not just for her body, but for her spirit. He was not just accepting her past. He was offering a future that was its complete opposite. He was offering a gentleness that would heal the harshness she had known. He was offering a lifetime of that healing. Tears finally spilled over and traced clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. They were tears of relief, of a burden finally set down. He let the silence stretch, giving her time. Then he began to speak, his voice low and steady, a calming counterpoint to the drumming of the rain. He told her about Hosho. He did not use the Dine word, but he described the idea. He said his people believed in walking in balance, that a person's life should be like a good path, straight and true. To live in that way, you had to be in harmony with the earth, with the sky, with the people around you, and most importantly, with yourself. He said that a man who takes from a woman without her spirit being in harmony with his is a man walking a crooked path. He brings disharmony to himself and to her. It is a violation of the world's balance. He was not just making a promise to her. He was explaining the law of his own soul, the code that guided his every action. His respect for her was not a matter of chivalry. It was a matter of cosmic order. He fell silent again, and the only sounds were the fire and the rain. The tension of her confession had been replaced by a deep and settled peace. He had taken her shame and offered her a sacred philosophy in its place. He held out his hand, not in a romantic gesture, but in a simple, open offering. She looked at his hand, strong and calloused from the rains and the land itself. She placed her own hand in his. His grip was firm and warm. It was not a lover's caress. It was a handshake, a deal being sealed, a promise being given and accepted in the oldest and most honest way. He held her hand for a long moment, a silent affirmation of the words that had passed between them. Then he released it. The small fire warmed them. The rain washed the world outside, and inside their small, temporary shelter, something broken began to heal. The next morning, the world was reborn. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a sky of impossible clarity and an earth that smelled of life and wet clay. The sun turned the puddles on the ground to sheets of hammered silver. As they saddled the horses, Chi reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small object wrapped in a piece of soft leather. He handed it to her. She unwrapped it. It was a knife, but a small one, its handle carved from a piece of pale, smooth wood. It was perfectly balanced, a practical tool, not an ornament. It was a weapon, a way for her to protect herself. She looked closer at the handle, carved into its surface. With exquisite, patient detail was the image of a flower, its tall stalk and bell-shaped blossoms unmistakable. A yucca, the flower that blooms in the desert after the rain. She looked at him, her throat tight with emotion. The gift was a mirror of their conversation. It was both practical and beautiful, an acknowledgement of the dangers of their world and a promise of the resilience and new life that could grow even in the harshest conditions. She tucked the knife into her belt. "You smile more with your eyes than with your mouth," she said, the words coming out with a new, easy confidence. He finished tightening the cinch on his saddle before he answered. "Saves words. The wind carries them away." A real smile touched her lips then. "And this time," he answered with a faint one of his own. They mounted their horses. They had not shared a kiss. They had not spoken words of love in the way the poets in her books back east did. But as they rode out into the clean, bright morning, they were as committed to each other as any two people could be. They were partners, their purpose aligned, their spirits in harmony. The ceremonies, the formal joining of their two worlds, could wait. First, they had a school to save. Their return to Dry Needle was not a homecoming. It was the quiet arrival of 2 soldiers returning to the front line. The town they had left behind was now openly fractured. The daily wages from the Copper Star had proven to be a powerful temptation, and the line between neighbors was now drawn in dust and silver coins. Men who had once shared a drink at the saloon now passed each other with averted eyes. The air was thick with a tension that was different from the heat, a human-made thing, heavy with suspicion and fear. Joel McKinnon, Alma Reyes, and Hattie Bell met them in the back room of the eatery. The door bolted. The news they brought was grim. Rusk's gunmen, a collection of hard cases and drifters, now patrolled the town as if they owned it. The sheriff was a ghost, rarely seen outside his office. Joel confessed that his authority as a deputy meant nothing. He was one man against a company's payroll. But they had not been idle. Alma, with her quiet, unshakable resolve, had started a list. She called it the School and Well Committee. It was a simple petition, written in her neat, clear hand on a piece of foolscap, stating that the undersigned residents of Dry Needle refused to sell their land or water rights to the Copper Star Railroad and protested the company's campaign of intimidation. Hattie had been the first to sign, her signature a bold, angry slash. Joel had been the second. Now, they were collecting other names. A slow and sometimes dangerous process of visiting ranches and homesteads after dark. It was a small act of defiance, a paper shield against an army of hired guns. Chi listened to all of this, his face impassive. He respected their courage, but he knew a petition would not stop a man like Rusk. He explained what he and Lena had learned on the trail, that the legal summons was a lie, a lure to capture Lena and use her as a lever against the town. The news landed with a heavy thud in the small room. It was worse than they had imagined. Hasty and Nez had given Chi counsel before he had left. The old man had said that a single thread is weak, but many threads woven together can pull a wagon from the mud. Chi knew that the committee's petition was one thread. They needed another, stronger one. They needed proof that could not be dismissed or lost in a drawer. Proof of bribery. Of the guns Rusk was stockpiling. They had to get inside the railroad camp. The plan was desperate. Chi gathered a small, trusted group. There was a young, hot-headed nephew of Alma's named Mateo, whose family had grazed sheep on this land for 100 years. There was a quiet Anglo rancher named Silas, a man of few words who had lost half his herd because the railroad crews had cut off his access to a summer pasture. And, to the surprise of some, Hattie Bell insisted on coming. She said she was a better shot than most men and she owed the railroad for her bees. Lena, too, would go. She was the only one who might recognize her uncle's name or handwriting. Chi would lead them. His knowledge of the land, of how to move without being seen, was their only real advantage. They went at dusk, that brief, magical time when the sky bleeds from orange to purple and the shadows grow long and deep. The railroad camp was a city of noise and firelight, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of men gambling. The smell of frying meat and stale whiskey filled the air. Chi led them in a wide circle, approaching the camp from the rear, where the vast supply warehouse stood like a dark mountain against the fading light. They moved from one pool of shadow to the next, their hearts beating a frantic rhythm against their ribs. The warehouse was guarded, but the guards were lazy, more interested in the sounds of life coming from the main camp than in the silent darkness behind them. Chi created a diversion, a single, perfectly thrown rock that clattered against a stack of metal barrels 100 yards away. When the guards went to investigate, Chi and the others slipped through the unguarded rear door. The air inside the warehouse was cool and smelled of canvas, machine oil, and raw lumber. In the dim light from the dusty windows, they saw the truth of Rusk's operation. There were crates of new rifles, far more than any railroad crew would need for hunting. And there were boxes stenciled with a warning, a skull and crossbones above the words, "Monkey Explosives." It was a powerful, unstable form of dynamite. perfect for blasting through rock or for turning a small town into a crater. While the others stood watch, Lena and Chi made their way to a small, partitioned office at the far end of the warehouse. It was Rusk's den. A desk was littered with maps and shipping manifests. A heavy ledger book lay open on its surface. This was what they had come for. Chi stood guard at the office door, his rifle ready, while Lena lit a small, shielded lantern. Her hands moved quickly over the papers. She saw it almost immediately. A list of payments, bribes disguised as consulting fees, made out to the town sheriff and to 2 other men on the town council. This was the proof. But then she saw something else. On a separate sheet of correspondence tucked under the ledger, it was a letter, written on expensive Boston stationery. The signature at the bottom made her blood run cold. Barnaby Pike. It was a shareholder's letter, discussing his significant investment in the Copper Star's expansion into the territory. He wrote of his confidence in Foreman Rusk's methods for acquiring the necessary land grants. And he made a casual, chilling reference to his troublesome ward, whose presence in the territory was an unforeseen complication, but one that he was confident Rusk could turn to their mutual advantage. The world buckled under Lena's feet. It was all one plot: her flight for freedom, the ambush, the fire, the summons, her uncle's greed, and the railroad's ambition. They were all threads of the same suffocating net. She was not a pawn they had decided to use. She had been the target all along. She showed the letter to Chi. A dark, dangerous light flared in his eyes. He took the ledger and the letter. They had what they needed. It was time to go. As they slipped back toward the main floor of the warehouse, they heard footsteps approaching the office. Rusk. He was walking back from the main camp, whistling a tuneless, self-satisfied melody. He was alone. Chi pushed Lena and the others into the deep shadow behind a stack of crates. He raised his rifle, the barrel resting on the edge of a wooden box. Through the sights, he could see Rusk's head and shoulders, perfectly framed in the doorway of the office. It was a simple shot, a clean end to the man who had poisoned their well, burned their school, and threatened their lives. The warrior in him, the man who had seen his people suffer and die, screamed for that justice. One shot, and it would be over. But he hesitated. He saw Lena's face, pale and determined in the darkness. He thought of Hastianez, of the crooked path of vengeance and the straight path of balance. To kill Rusk now would be an act of retribution, but it would not be justice. It would make them no different from their enemy. It would turn them into the very thing they were fighting against. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the rifle. Instead, his eyes darted to the crate of rifles beside him. He pulled out his knife and, in a few swift, silent motions, pried open the lid. He did not take a rifle. He memorized the serial number stamped into the receiver of the top one. He motioned for Silas to do the same with the box of explosives. This was a different kind of weapon, one Joel McKinnon could use. Evidence, not blood. Their luck ran out as they reached the rear door. One of the returning guards saw Mateo's shadow move. The guard shouted. A shot rang out, splintering the doorframe. The raid was over. The escape had begun. They burst out into the night, running for the cover of the darkness. Gunshots erupted from the camp behind them. They did not run back the way they had come. Chi led them on a different path, a desperate course straight into a wide, dark patch of land that shimmered faintly in the starlight, a field of cholla cactus. There was no time for caution. They plunged into it. The pain was immediate and shocking. The cholla seemed to leap onto them, its barbed spines piercing through their clothes and into their skin. It was a unique, agonizing pain, a burning, stinging torment that made every step a fresh hell. A spine caught in Lena's arm, and, as she tried to brush it away, the entire segment of cactus broke off and attached itself to her hand. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath against the searing pain. They pushed on, driven by the shouts and gunshots behind them, stumbling, falling, and rising again, each movement adding to their collection of painful, clinging burrs. They finally broke through the other side and collapsed, gasping and bleeding, into the safety of a dry wash. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them. No one was foolish enough to follow them through the Shoya at night. They had the letter, they had the ledger, and they had the numbers. They had won, but it was a victory that had left every single one of them bleeding. In the days that followed, the town of Dry Needle learned the price of knowledge. While Hattie and Alma treated their wounds, the social divide in the town deepened. The men working for the railroad saw the raid as an act of aggression, proof that Chi and his followers were dangerous radicals. They feared losing their wages, their only source of steady income. Lena saw this fear and understood it. She knew Rusk could manipulate these people because they were trapped by their poverty and their inability to read the contracts they were being pressured to sign. And so, she started a new school. In the evenings, by lantern light, she gathered the adults who wanted to learn. She did not teach them poetry. She taught them how to read and write their own names. She used the charred blackboard, now remounted in a new, rough-hewn frame and set up in the open air next to Alma's eatery. "We learned to write our names," she told the small, hesitant group of ranchers and laborers, "so that no one can steal them from us. We learned to read the words, so we know the promises we are making and the lies we are being told." She stood before them, a teacher with her chalk, offering a different kind of weapon in their fight. The new blackboard stood on the scarred and burned remnants of the old one. It was a symbol for all to see. The future, she was showing them, had to be built on the ashes of the past. The final confrontation did not arrive with the thunder of a cavalry charge, but with the grinding finality of a locomotive. Foreman Rusk, flanked by his newly arrived partner in greed, Barnaby Pike, led a small army of hired guns down the single dusty street of Dry Needle. Their faces were hard, their eyes devoid of anything but cold purpose. They moved with the swagger of men who believed they had already won. Their objective was simple and brutal: seize the well, burn the last remnants of the school, and capture the woman who had become the unlikely heart of the town's resistance. But Dry Needle was not sleeping. Chi had seen them coming. A plume of dust on the horizon that was too large and moved with too much intent to be a simple supply wagon. He had spent the previous day preparing, not for a battle, but for a defense. His strategy, born of a deep respect for life and a tactical understanding of the land, was not to kill, but to disable, to confuse, and to outwit. Under his quiet direction, the townspeople had transformed the area around the blackened school wall and the well into a landscape of subtle traps. They had dug shallow trenches, filled with loose sand to trip up charging horses. Tripwires, almost invisible in the dust, were strung between mesquite bushes, connected to empty cans that would rattle and clang. On the rooftop of Alma's eatery, Hattie Bell and Alma herself presided over a large pot, not of tar, but of honey, bubbling over a low fire. Beside it were sacks of dried red chili peppers, their pungent, fiery potential waiting to be released. The children and the town's elderly had been moved before dawn, led by the older dine women down into the safety of a deep, winding wash a quarter-mile away. Their exodus, a silent, prayerful procession. As Rusk's men advanced, the sky itself seemed to join the conflict. The wind picked up, but instead of bringing cool relief, it carried a fine, gritty rain of dust, a phenomenon that turned the air hazy and ochre. It was not a true rain, but a dry shower that coated every surface in a film of red grit, blurring the edges of the world and making a man's eyes sting and water. The attack began. Rusk's men charged forward, whooping and firing their pistols into the air. Their confidence was their first mistake. The lead horses hit the sand trenches and stumbled, throwing their riders into the dust. The tripwires sang, and the clatter of tin cans created a confusing, disorienting racket. The real battle was a chaotic, swirling melee. The sound was a bizarre symphony of violence. The sharp crack of rifles answered not by other rifles, but by the heavy, ringing clang of railroad sledgehammers. wielded by Silas and the other ranchers. It was a fight of iron against lead, of brute force against calculated defense. From the rooftop, Alma and Hattie began their own unique assault. They hurled clay jars of the boiling honey down into the street. The jars shattered, not with a lethal explosion, but with a sticky, viscous splash that made the ground treacherous. The hot, sweet smoke that rose from the splattered honey was thick and cloying, a bizarrely pleasant scent to mix with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Deputy Joel McKinnon, his face set and determined, did not take cover. He walked into the middle of the street, his pistol held steady, and called Rusk's name. The big foreman, enraged by the unexpected resistance, turned to face him. The two men stood for a moment, an island of focused hatred in the swirling chaos. The lawman and the brute, their personal battle the symbolic core of the larger fight. It was Barnaby Pike who saw the true prize, while Rusk was occupied with Joel. Barnaby, his face pale with a mixture of fear and avarice, dismounted and moved through the confusion. He saw Lena standing near the well, directing the defenders. To him, she was not a person, but a legal document, a key to a fortune. He raised his pistol, the barrel glinting in the dusty light. He was 10 feet away when he leveled the gun at her heart. Lena froze, the sounds of the fight fading to a dull roar in her ears. In that moment, she was back in Boston, a girl trapped in a parlor, her future being decided by this same cruel, weak man. Chi moved. He did not draw his rifle. He simply stepped in front of her, his body a shield, his gaze locked on Barnaby. He stood perfectly still, a silent, unmovable challenge. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Barnaby's finger tightened on the trigger. Then, a new voice cut through the air. "Drop it, Pike!" The voice was lazy, almost bored, but it held the cold weight of absolute authority. It was the sheriff. He stood on the boardwalk of his office, his paunchy form suddenly seeming solid and imposing. He was not looking at Rusk or the hired guns. His pistol was aimed squarely at the back of Barnaby Pike's head. Barnaby's eyes widened in disbelief. "But you work for us," he stammered. The sheriff spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "I work for the law," he said. It just took me a while to decide which side of it I was on. As if this were his cue, Joel McKinnon threw the weapon he had been saving. It was not a gun or a knife. It was the railroad ledger. It tumbled through the air, and he had tied it in such a way that it opened as it fell, its pages scattering like wounded birds in the dusty wind. The handwritten entries, the lists of bribes paid to the sheriff and others, fluttered down into the middle of the crowd. Men on both sides stopped fighting to look. The proof of Rusk's corruption was literally falling from the sky. The wind chose that moment to shift. It swirled, picking up the pungent, choking smoke from the sacks of chili peppers that Hattie had ignited and thrown down. The thick, incapacitating cloud, which had been meant for the attackers, was blown back into their own faces. The hired guns, blinded and choking, their eyes streaming, lost their nerve. They broke and ran, a disorganized rout of coughing, cursing men fleeing a cloud of weaponized seasoning. And then, as if the heavens themselves wanted to add a final, terrifying exclamation point to the proceedings, a fork of lightning split the ochre sky. It was a jagged, brilliant tear in the fabric of the afternoon. It did not strike a man or a building. It struck the wagon at the edge of town where Rusk had stored his surplus of monkey explosives. There was a deafening crack, a flash of white light, and a violent concussion that threw men to the ground. The wagon erupted, not in a single, massive fireball, but in a shower of burning splinters. A plume of black smoke billowed into the sky, but the fine, gritty rain, which had seemed like a curse, now revealed itself as a blessing. The damp dust had settled on the wagon, on the fuses, on the dry grass around it. The moisture, though slight, was just enough to prevent the secondary explosions, just enough to stop the fire from spreading. The catastrophe had been averted by a few drops of muddy water. In the ringing silence that followed, the fight was over. Barnaby Pike stood trembling, the sheriff's gun still aimed at his head. Foreman Rusk, his face a mask of shocked disbelief as Joel McKinnon snapped a pair of handcuffs onto his wrists, looked like a man who could not comprehend how the world had so completely and utterly turned against him. The community of Dry Needle had held. They stood, bruised and grimy, among the scattered pages of the ledger and the sticky puddles of honey, and they looked at each other. They had faced down the railroad, and they had won. And in the strange, rain-washed, lightning-scorched quiet, they knew the most important truth of all. Thanks to the quiet warrior who had taught them to fight without the killing rage, not a single life had been lost. Their victory was not just for their land and their water, it was for their own souls. The storm passed, leaving behind a world scoured clean and unnervingly quiet. In the aftermath, the town of Dry Needle was a place of deep, collective exhaustion. The hired guns had vanished, melting back into the desert from which they had come. Barnaby Pike and Foreman Rusk were prisoners, locked in the sheriff's 2 small cells, their blustering threats reduced to sullen silence. The pages of the ledger, gathered carefully by the children, were stacked on Joel McKinnon's desk, a paper monument to a victory that still felt fragile and dreamlike. A week later, authority arrived in a buckboard wagon, not with the force of arms, but in the person of a single, tired-looking man in a dusty suit. He was the territorial commissioner, a man named Dawson, whose face was etched with the weariness of 1,000 such disputes. He spent 2 days in Dry Needle. He reviewed the ledger. He read Joel's meticulous report, which included the serial numbers from the rifles and the explosives. He interviewed the sheriff, who, with the stoicism of a man who had chosen his side late but decisively, told the unvarnished truth. He listened to Alma, to Hattie, and to Lena. On the 3rd day, he rendered his judgment in the middle of the street, his voice dry and official but carrying the weight of law. The Copper Star Railroad was found guilty of conspiracy, bribery, and reckless endangerment. They would pay a substantial fine to the territorial government. A second, separate fine would be paid directly to a newly established Dry Needle Community Fund, to be administered by a council consisting of Alma Reyes, Hattie Bell, and Joel McKinnon. The railroad's route was to be officially redrawn, skirting the communal grazing lands by a wide margin. Rusk and his men were to be transported to the territorial prison to stand trial. Barnaby Pike, for his part in the conspiracy, would be sent back east to face federal charges. It was over. The hammering of the railroad, which had been the soundtrack to their fears for so long, would not return. A quiet, profound sense of relief settled over the town. The weight they had been carrying for months was finally lifted. In the wake of this legal peace, a more delicate and important healing began. The divisions in the community, the mistrust sown by Rusk's wages, needed mending. It was Hestian Nez who took the first step. He came to the outdoor school, where Lena was teaching a lesson on fractions using a divided apple. He did not come with demands. He came with a quiet, reasonable proposal. He sat with Lena on an upturned crate and spoke of the importance of a child's first language. He explained that their words for the world, for the mesas and the sky and the corn, were not just labels. They were stories. They contained the soul of their people. To forbid a child from speaking them was to make them a stranger in their own heart. Lena listened, not as a teacher from Boston, but as a woman who had learned the value of a person's true self. She understood immediately. She agreed without hesitation. From that day on, the soft, musical sounds of the Dine language were heard in the school, no longer a whispered rebellion, but a welcome part of the daily lesson. But Lena went a step further. She sent word with the children, inviting their mothers to a new kind of class, an evening class, held by lantern light, for women only. She called it the Letters and Herbs class. The first night, the Dine women came, shy and hesitant, their hands accustomed to the loom and the grinding stone, not the pen. They were soon joined by Alma, Hattie, and the wives of the Anglo ranchers. Lena taught them their letters, the magic of turning sounds into marks on a slate. In return, the dying women taught her, and the others, their own knowledge. They brought roots and leaves, explaining in their soft voices which herb could soothe a fever, which poultice could draw out a sting, which tea could bring calm sleep. They were weaving their two worlds together, one shared lesson at a time. It was in this atmosphere of quiet rebuilding and gentle reconciliation that Lena and Chi decided to marry. There was no formal proposal. It was an understanding that had been forged in the desert rain and sealed by the fire. They needed no other declaration, but they wanted their union to be witnessed, to be a part of the community they had fought to save. And so, they planned two ceremonies, a quiet acknowledgement of the two different worlds that were coming together as one. The first took place at dawn. Hasty and Nez led them to the base of a tall, red rock mesa that caught the first rays of the rising sun. There were no flowers, no music, only the vast silence of the desert waking up. The old man spoke in his own language, his voice a low, melodic chant. The words were a blessing, a prayer for a life lived in Hozo. He spoke of a path of beauty, of living with a steady heart, of being as enduring as the stone at their backs and as honest as the light that was now flooding the world. They did not exchange rings. They exchanged a simple pledge to walk this path together in balance. The second ceremony was a reflection of the first, a town affair. They gathered in Alma's eatery, which had been cleared of its tables and decorated with swaths of wildflowers gathered by the children. The whole town was there, their face scrubbed clean, their recent divisions forgotten in the shared joy of the moment. Joel McKinnon, looking slightly uncomfortable but proud, stood beside them as the official witness. Alma and Hattie stood with Lena, not as bridesmaids, but as the family she had chosen, the family who had chosen her. A traveling preacher, passing through town, read a simple passage from the Bible. The vows were short and plain-spoken, promises of fidelity and care that everyone could understand. Afterward, the eatery was filled with the sounds of a fiddle and laughter. Chi, for the first and likely the last time in his life, was wearing a waistcoat, a slightly too small garment borrowed from the general store. He moved with a stiff, uncharacteristic awkwardness, as if the unfamiliar clothing was a cage. Lena came up beside him, a smile playing on her lips. She wore a simple dress of pale cotton, sewn for her by Alma and Hattie. "You are so handsome," she whispered to him, her eyes dancing with gentle humor, "that I am worried Hattie's bees might leave their hive to follow you." A rare, true smile broke across his face, a sight that made Lena's heart feel as bright and open as the morning sky. Amid the celebration, they found a quiet moment alone. Lena's hand went to her waist, to the small, yucca-handled knife he had given her. It was still there, tucked into the sash of her wedding dress. It was a strange accessory for a bride, a symbol of the harshness they had endured, but also of the strength she had found. It was a part of her now, a part of their story. She then reached into a small bag and took something out. It was a single, perfect piece of white chalk. She pressed it into his hand, his fingers, strong and calloused, closed around its fragile softness. "You teach the trails," she said softly. "I will teach the letters." It was her own vow, her promise of their shared future, a partnership of two different kinds of knowledge, two different kinds of strength. The work of rebuilding the school began the next day. It was a community effort. The men who had recently taken the railroad silver now worked alongside the men they had shunned, their shared labor a silent apology. They salvaged the good timber and adobe bricks, and slowly, a new, stronger structure began to rise. They built a long ramada over the dusty patch of ground beside it, to give the children shade to play in. One afternoon, as the men were setting the final support posts for the new shelter, young Taji, his breathing now clear and easy, picked up a piece of chalk on the smooth, pale wood of a new post. He began to draw. It was a tall stalk with a crown of bell-shaped blossoms, a yucca. Soon, another child joined him, and then another. By the end of the day, the posts of the new school shelter were covered in the white, chalky outlines of the flower that blooms in the desert after the rain, a spontaneous, hopeful testament to the future they were all building together. The seasons turned, and the land, ever patient, began to heal its own scars. The wind smoothed the edges of the wagon ruts left by Rusk's men, and the first green shoots of new grass began to push through the earth where the explosives wagon had burned. In Dry Needle, a deeper healing was taking place, a quiet mending of the human heart. The new schoolhouse stood as a testament to this, its pale adobe walls solid and promising under the vast Arizona sky. It had been built not just with timber and mud, but with the shared purpose of a community that had been broken and had chosen to remake itself, stronger than before. Lena Hart, now Lena Begay, had found the freedom she had once thought was a place on a map. She discovered it was not a destination, but a state of being, built day by day with calloused hands and a stubborn heart. The fearful young woman who had arrived in a cloud of red dust was gone. In her place was a leader, a woman who moved with a quiet confidence, whose voice could command the attention of a room full of rowdy children or negotiate peace between two squabbling ranchers. She had learned that true independence was not the absence of reliance on others, but the freedom to choose who to trust, and the strength to accept a love that did not seek to control, but to support. For Chi, the peace was a quieter, more internal thing. The ghosts of the long walk, the shadows of a past filled with loss and displacement, had not vanished, but they no longer walked beside him. They had receded, replaced by the present, by the solid weight of Lena's hand in his, by the sounds of children learning their letters in two different languages. He had been a warrior, defined by his ability to survive and to fight. Now, he was a protector, a man who had faced the ultimate test of his discipline and had chosen justice over the easy, satisfying release of vengeance. In choosing not to take Rusk's life, he had saved a part of his own soul, preserving the balance he held so sacred. He had learned to open his heart, to accept the heavy, beautiful weight of commitment to another person and to a community. He had, at last, found his own place of Hoso. The town itself had settled into a new, more honest version of itself. Joel McKinnon wore his deputy's star with a new authority, born not just of the law, but of the respect he had earned. Alma's Eatery remained the town's heart, a place where news was shared over coffee and problems were halved by sharing them. Hattie Bell's new beehives thrived, a buzzing, orderly world of sweet creation. And Dr. Sage Walker could often be found at one of Alma's tables in the morning, a cup of steaming coffee in his hands, which, more often than not, were now steady. Life for Lena and Chi took on a gentle, domestic rhythm, punctuated by the small, humorous frictions of two different worlds learning to live as one. One afternoon, they were in the small patch of land behind their modest adobe home, trying to plant a small crop of corn. Chi, with his innate understanding of the earth, was trying to explain the precise depth at which a seed must be planted to find moisture, but not rot. Lena, her hands covered in dirt, looked up at the cloudless sky. "Are you sure we should be doing this? There is not a cloud in sight. It has not rained in a month." Chi continued his work, not looking up. "The rain will come. The ground knows. We plant now to be ready." "But what if it does not? What if all our work is for nothing?" she pressed, a shadow of her old Boston practicality surfacing. He finally stopped and looked at her, a slow smile touching the corners of his eyes. "Then we will have done the work. The ground will remember our promise, and we will have learned to be patient. It is never for nothing. Besides," he added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I have a plan." "And what is that?" "I will ask you to sing. Your singing is so bad, the sky will weep in pity and send the rain just to make you stop." She threw a small clod of dirt at him, and his quiet laughter was a sound she knew she would never grow tired of hearing. A month after their wedding, the territorial commissioner's presence returned to Dry Needle, this time in the form of a letter. Carried by the mail rider, it was addressed to them both. They read it together, standing in the shade of the new schoolhouse shelter, the children's chalk drawings of yucca flowers a hopeful audience. The letter was formal, but its message was extraordinary. Commissioner Dawson, impressed by the town's resilience and by the peaceful bilingual truce Lena had brokered, had a proposal. He offered Lena a newly created position supervisor of bilingual education for the Western Territory. It was a chance to take the model of her small, dusty school and offer it to other communities, to build bridges of understanding across the cultural divides of the frontier. For Chi, there was another offer. The territorial rangers were in desperate need of men who understood the land, men who could track and navigate and survive in its harshest corners. They wanted him to establish and lead a training program for their local scouts, to teach them the skills that could not be learned from any army manual. They were being offered a future, a purpose larger than they had ever imagined. But as they read the words, they both knew, without having to speak, that their answer depended on one thing. That evening, Lena sat at a rough-hewn table, a pen in her hand. She wrote a careful, respectful reply to Commissioner Dawson. She and her husband thanked him for his generous offers. They accepted both positions, but with a single, non-negotiable condition: the schoolhouse of Dry Needle and the community, well, that gave it life, must be granted a territorial charter, a permanent, legally binding deed that would protect them in perpetuity, long after they were all gone. Their freedom, their new lives, had been forged in the fight for this place. They would not abandon it now. They were tying their own futures to the future of the community. They understood now that true freedom was not an escape. It was the responsibility you chose to carry. As she signed her name, Lena looked at the small, yucca-handled knife lying on the table beside the inkwell. Courage, she thought, was not the heat of the moment when a trigger was pulled. It was the quiet resolve to keep your hand steady when the world was on fire, to choose the harder path of building over the easier path of breaking. She looked at the new schoolhouse outside the window, its walls golden in the late afternoon sun. Freedom was not a wild and passing gust of wind. It was a classroom, a well, a community, built with patience and calloused hands. The final scene of their struggle came, as the first had, with the rising of the sun. The dawn broke over the eastern mesas, a breathtaking explosion of pink and rose and gold that set the red rocks ablaze with color. A small bell, hung from a post beside the school, began to ring, its clear, cheerful sound carrying on the crisp morning air. The children came, running down the single street, their laughter echoing in the quiet. They poured into the new schoolhouse, a river of life and promise. Chi stood by the open door. He reached into his pocket and took out a fresh, new piece of white chalk. He did not give it to Lena. Instead, he placed it on a small wooden ledge just inside the doorway, a silent, daily offering to the world of words and ideas she commanded. Lena watched him, a deep and abiding love filling her heart. She then walked to the post where the bell rope hung. Beside it, on a small wooden peg, she hung the yucca knife. It rested there, the symbol of her survival and her strength, hanging side by side with the bell that called the future to order. They stood together in the doorway, the sounds of the children settling into their lesson inside, the vast, beautiful, and dangerous land stretching out before them. They did not need to speak of the future. They were home. They looked at each other, and in the quiet, shared smile that passed between them. A new day and a new life had already begun. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the heart of the Wild West. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect, and do not forget to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more listeners.